I want to talk about a series of events that I've been involved in, first as a consultant, then as a co-director, then a director. There was an organization called Reuniting America. And this is late 2000s, for quite a few years. And what we did is we did retreats. We would take 20 to 25 leaders, all across the political spectrum, liberals, conservatives, libertarians, progressives, people that are well known on television, and we take them and remove them out of Washington, D.C., except for one time, and that was a huge mistake, and I can talk about that later. And we take them in settings across the country, really mostly beautiful settings. And we have 3 days of professionally facilitated dialogues. And we bring in Mark Gerzon from the Mediators Foundation or Bill Urey from Harvard as two examples of two amazing facilitators. And they would do pretty much what I said before. They would humanize the political process. They would get these folks who usually normally, at least on television, fight with one another, talking with one another. And through those kind of conversations and curiosity development, like who are you, why do you believe what you believe in? Oh, that's really interesting, let me know more. You kind of go down that path, get to know the person a little bit better. You humanize the political process because once you get to know someone in that kind of setting, you can't attack them characterologically in the same way you could prior to that. I mean, you can debate ideas, you can disagree with them, which is great, that's fine, but you can't like call them a knuckle-dragging conservative or commie this or whatever people call each other. So those retreats humanize the political process, found a lot of common ground once you start having these kind of conversations, and a lot of really interesting campaigns emerge from these kind of retreats. Now, one retreat we did, and this is actually not part of Reuniting America, this is kind of probably as a result of that kind of model, was one we did 2011, which we did in Georgia. There's an island off the coast of Georgia. And so we got 25 folks down there, fresh and facilitated, and it's around the Pentagon. And there was an agreement across the political spectrum that we're spending way too much money at the Pentagon. The top line was way too high, especially during the peacetime, because this is, towards the end, the Iraq war is kind of winding down. It had winded down. ISIS was just starting to emerge, but it wasn't the big threat it became. And even that is a different conversation. But peacetime, generally peacetime, the Pentagon budget should reduce. So there's general agreement that there should be reductions in the overall top line. Also, there were certain weapons programs that everyone agreed to were wasting taxpayer money. It was more about crony capitalism and jobs and money for the Congress members than it was about protecting the United States and serving the men and women who put on the uniform. So out of that retreat, those few days we got together, professionally facilitated, this Pentagon campaign emerged, the Pentagon budget campaign. And it's been in existence ever since. And it's great communication. We have calls every week. And these are liberals and libertarians and conservatives and progressives who get on the calls. We have meetings regularly. We actually have a retreat coming up. We have a retreat every year for 2 days. We'll figure out this next year. So that is one example of kind of cooperation across the political spectrum as a result of a retreat where we're attempting to solve a particular problem. In this case, wasting taxpayer money. So it's really interesting how we decide who attends the original retreat when we launch a campaign, and which a campaign launches from. So there's a few ways that we think about. All right, who are the leaders of organizations that we want to engage? So that could be one class of people. Who are the policy experts? Because even leaders of particular organizations, although they might engage on a particular issue like Pentagon reform, doesn't mean that's their thing. They might have an interest in it. So we always want to bring experts or SMEs, subject matter experts, who know a lot about either the overall Pentagon budget or particular weapons systems. So we think about that too. Who do we need to bring? Also, not only who leads groups like advocacy groups, but who leads grassroots groups. Because eventually when you launch a campaign, you need to get people calling their members of Congress or faxing or showing up for events or whatever. So we think about those kind of things. And those kind of people we invite to all our different retreats that we've had over the years, especially the Pentagon budget one. But it's not just those kind of people. It's also people who can play well with others. Because you can have someone who's like the most brilliant person on Pentagon spending, but if they don't have social skills and they're going to kind of ruin the opportunity for everyone to get together and talk, we don't want them there. They might be the second round of people we invite in, But the first 25 people or 20 to 25 people for any of these retreats we've done are people who fit one of those roles and we know will play well with others. So it would be someone that I know or someone who's on the team that's deciding who attends, that I would say, oh, that person would be great, and I know that they're open to a conversation. Or someone else on a team, I say, oh, I know this person. They're great on this particular piece of this issue, and they're open to a conversation. Awesome. Let's bring them together. So it's the relationships which generate the list of people to attend. And you might have a second round of people that you consider who we invite in later to other types of meetings as the campaign gets launched and moves forward. I did some work for the Campaign for Liberty, and this is Ron Paul's group. And for folks who don't remember Ron Paul, he ran 2008, I believe, for the president as a Republican. He's very hardcore libertarian, but if you watch his voting record, he worked across the aisle a lot in Congress. Now with tons of people, because he was a hardcore civil libertarian as an example. So there are Democrats who are good civil libertarians and Republicans that he would work with, but unfortunately not enough of them. So he worked across the aisle, but unfortunately his issues weren't popular enough in Congress, unfortunately for us as American citizens. But so I worked for his group, and they brought me on, and this is usually how I work. I either get hired by a nonprofit to build out a campaign or launch a coalition, or I get hired by a foundation to do the same. So the Campaign for Liberty hired me to help organize and run a transpartisan coalition on audit of the Federal Reserve. This is after the 2008 crash. And Dr. Paul, who founded the Campaign for Liberty, was a strong opponent of the Federal Reserve. He had been since the 1970s. So that was kind of one of his big issues. So they hired me to create and run this campaign. And I work with Jane Hampshire from Five Dog Lake. She's a well-known progressive. And so she kind of helped organize the center-left side of things. I helped organize the center-right side of things. We got together a lot and worked together. And it was an amazing coalition because it was like in the Senate we had Rand Paul, libertarian leaning Republican, Bernie Sanders, self-proclaimed social democrat, and I think it was Jim DeMint, conservative Republican who eventually went to a Heritage Foundation. So you had the libertarian, the socialist, and the conservative, very transpartisan in the Senate, and then we had in the House we had support as well. So we had the bill in the House and the bill in the Senate. We actually passed it, got signed into law. It was an amazing effort because most people have no idea what the Federal Reserve is, what it does. They hear about it in the news, but there's not really deep knowledge of it. Most members of Congress have no idea what it is. And those few who do, who are like on the financial services, have deep invested interest in protecting the Federal Reserve. So those were the people we had to actually oppose and get the rest of the Congress to support an audit. And we actually got an audit done. It was a modified audit. It wasn't the full audit that Ron Paul originally wanted, but we got a lot of really useful information from the GAO. GAO did a report on it, found out about the hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars and trillions of dollars that the Federal Reserve loaned to domestic and foreign banks and businesses to keep them afloat. So it was like the worst of crony capitalism you could imagine. And that was a great example of a successful transpartisan coalition. So another case study that I can talk about is election security, which is very timely, as you can imagine, because the 2020 election is coming up, and there were a lot of concerns from the 2016 election in terms of the vulnerability of our election systems at the state level. Reports from the Senate about attempts by Russia to break into the various systems, and et cetera, et cetera. So it's in the zeitgeist. And the way my work works is all relationship-based. So I was actually on vacation with my wife and my dogs, and I got a call from a former Hill staffer who was a friend of mine who I met as a result of my work on the Pentagon budget, who asked me if I had some free time to do a new project. I said, well, I'm interested, tell me more. He said, election security. It's a big topic, it's coming up, and we want your help to create a more transpartisan coalition. So I did a call with the guy who runs the organization that hired me, NEDC. His name is Ben, great guy, amazing guy. You all would benefit from learning more about him. He's a progressive Democrat, used to be a Vermont senator. Amazing history. But we spoke on the phone. He told me what the problem was. I was like, that's great, something I support. I want fair elections. I don't want foreign or state or non-state actors interfering with our elections at any level, to any degree. I'll take it on. So I got hired to help build out the center-right part of the coalition and integrate it into the pre-existing center-left coalition. And we've been doing that for a few years. We've had some successes in terms of getting money allocated from the federal government to the state level to changing the voting, the architecture. Our basic intention is the machines need to produce paper ballots, and you need to have audit trails. Some of the higher tech machines are vulnerable to hacking. They're problematic. We go low tech, paper ballots and audit trails. And there are some tangential issues like securing the voter rolls that are part of this whole broader coalition. But it's been somewhat successful in terms of getting the money allocated. We are now fighting at the state level to make sure the money is well spent, which is obviously important because they can spend it on machines which make us just as vulnerable or even more vulnerable. But it's an example of another successful transpartisan coalition where we bring in well-known libertarians and conservatives with our progressive and liberal friends, help solve these problems. Now, not all coalitions or campaigns have been successful. I've just named a few, which tend to be more successful than not, but they don't always all work. They work in the sense of bringing people together to help solve the particular issue as a problem, but they don't necessarily change policy. That's a little bit more challenging than bringing people together, because then you actually have to get Congress to do something and whoever's running the White House to sign it into law. So one thing I think might be helpful for me to talk about is the day-to-day operations of launching a campaign and actually running a coalition. Like what we do on a day-to-day basis, or at least what I do as part of that effort. And I like to break bread. I'm paleo, so I actually don't break bread, but I like to eat. And I'm a tea drinker, so if I'm not eating, I'm drinking tea. So a lot of my meetings I do in terms of outreach to new groups or individuals to help getting new groups in is around food. I find that to be really helpful. Just eating and being more relaxed, not feeling rushed, or drinking tea or some coffee, whatever people drink. So what I do is a lot of meals in conversations with people that I think would benefit from knowing about a particular issue, trying to figure out what resources they might be able to contribute to benefit that particular issue, and then bringing them into the larger coalition to enhance and grow the coalition even further. So a lot of my time is either spent eating and talking, or I can do the same thing on phone calls or via email. Just reaching out to people who I think might be interested. They show some interest. I jump on a call, and then I would meet them for a meal. So the way I work is pretty much all relationship based. Like who do I need to help think about this issue in old or new ways? Convince them that it's important for them to spend their time and effort and resources, because everyone has limited resources, and then join our larger, broader left-right coalition. So on a day-to-day basis, that's the kind of work that I do. And then I also try to think about the three levels of organizing: grassroots, grass tops, and then kind of maybe the academic setting of folks who are kind of the SME experts. I call it academic or the SME stuff. So I will think about, okay, grass tops, what leaders of particular organizations do I need to talk to? And I've already kind of walked through, like I might have a meal with them or jump on a call or a Zoom or whatever. Who leads grassroots organizations that we want to pull into the effort? So I'll have conversations with them. Or I might know someone who knows someone, and hey, would you mind introducing me to that person? And I find, personal introductions go a long way, because there seems to be already trust built in, because that person knows me, knows that other person, hopefully trusts me enough to introduce me to someone they know. We eventually have the conversation. And then the way I also work is not only do I want to get someone, either the grassroots, grass tops, or the SME involved in my particular issue, but I'm a systems thinker, so I'm always thinking, what issues are you working on, this other person, that I might be helpful? Because I can't just be about me and my issue. I want to be helpful to them and their other issues they work on. So they might say, yes, I'm interested in your Pentagon reform, I'm interested in election security, I'm interested in audit the Fed, but I'm also working on X, Y, or Z. And then I'll think, oh wait, I know like 5 people who I think would benefit from knowing your work on that particular issue. Let me make those same introductions that you're willing to do for me, possibly with someone else, or that led me to meet you. So I'm always kind of thinking that way too. How can I be helpful to the other person, not just how can I get them to be helpful to me, my issue. So more of my time is actually spent doing that, like outreaching on behalf of other people's projects than even my own projects. Because I find karma, kind of circles back, and people like people helping them, and I like helping people. And then down the road, they might say, I just thought about someone else that might benefit your project, and you've been so nice to me with my project. So it's I hate to use the word quid pro quo, but it's like it's relationship, and people, when you get into relation with people, they like to help people out, and that's at least what I find. So I look at it as relationship building first and foremost, and then working on my particular issue secondary, and then working on their issues also secondarily, and how kind of this all fits together. One of the things I'm interested in understanding is institutions. As I said, I work with individuals, I work with institutions, and I think about systems. And obviously the government is a large institution with a lot of sub-institutions underneath it. We have a federal system, so we have federal government and the state government, et cetera, et cetera. And a lot of people, especially on my side, the center right, the libertarian conservative side of things, talk about the evils of government, and government's broken, and et cetera, et cetera. And the way I look at it is more like the founding fathers looked at it. I think that we tend to have tribal interests. That's why they set up the government the way they did, because they recognize that we tend towards our group and we compete with one another. That's kind of innate in us as human beings. They look back historically, that's the way we've operated. That's why they put checks and balances into place. And I would say for the most part, the government is operating as it's created to operate. Not necessarily as it is intended to operate by our founding fathers, but it's operating within the boundaries that we've created for it, that we've allowed it to operate in. I look at the government like I look at our money, the Federal Reserve note. It's not real. We give it power because we give it meaning. The government is not real. We give it power because we give it meaning. Government is just people like us running around doing stuff, and we give it certain meaning. So, and just like us in our own lives, we have interests, we have perspectives, we have defenses, all that kind of psychological stuff. That's also operating within individuals within the government. And that's why you have these competing interests, and that's why the state, broadly speaking, operates the way it does. I don't think it's broken. I think it's operating as it's intended to operate, as I said. That's why I have a personal interest as more of a libertarian-leaning person, is to move as much power away from that institution, because as I said earlier, as an institution, it has the power to kill you, deprive you of your money, and kidnap you or put you in jail. I don't like that as the basis of human relationships. I want to see more power taken away from large institutions. That's one example. There's other examples of large institutions I like to see disempowered and put back in the hands of individuals and families and communities. That's just my personal take on things. And I understand that people from other parts of the political spectrum prefer larger, bigger government to solve certain problems. I personally do not, and we can have that debate. As I said, because I think cooperation is a better basis of human relationship than force, and government is based on force. So I talked about kind of taking power away from large institutions like the government in this case, but there's others that we can talk about too. Business, et cetera, big business, big labor, big religion, whatever. But let's just stick with like, for the purposes of limiting those powers, not in and of themselves, but because I want to empower individuals, families, and communities. So how do you do that? Like, how do you, at the community level, for example, how do you get people together across the political spectrum to solve problems? Well, one thing that I find is helpful is holding your means lightly and your ends lightly. And what I mean by that is, for instance, if someone comes to me and says, there's this particular issue at my community level, this is the problem, I've already identified the problem, and this is a solution. So this is the means, and this is the ends. I want to solve this problem through this way. I would suggest to them as they go around engaging with other people in conversations, these dialogues that we've talked about, is to hold both those things very lightly. Because maybe their means to solve that problem is not the appropriate one for the larger group, the larger community. Maybe there are other ways of thinking about solving that problem. So be open to that. I mean, we should do that anyways in our own lives, independent of politics and social organization. But be open to the possibility the way you see of solving that problem is limited, it's partial, maybe it won't work at this time. And even the ends, like this is the problem, I've identified it. Well, maybe that problem is actually a symptom of a larger problem, and the mistake is focusing in on that symptom as opposed to a larger problem. So I would first suggest you go around talking to your neighbors, your people in your community, and asking them what they see is as the problem. If they see the same thing, generally speaking, what the problem might be that you as an individual might want to solve. And just be open to the possibility that they see it differently. They see it's a symptom of a larger problem. They see something completely different. They might see different means to those ends. And engage in those conversations with a wide variety of people. And then kind of map that out. Literally create a transpartisan map of that particular broad issue. Like how people see it, multiple different ways of seeing it, because that's one way of considering organizing around. Not everyone has to see it the same way. You can organize around different ways. For instance, I did a project in Texas that no one actually agreed on what the problem was, but they all agreed what the solution was, which was fascinating. And I'll give the example in a moment, but my only point is that, as a community organizer, hold lightly those two things, means and ends. Talk to your neighbors or people in your community, see how they see the world, create a larger transpartisan map of the possibilities, means and ends, symptoms versus the root cause, the root problem. And then you can start organizing around that. In Texas, and this is mid-2000s, and this is going to be a little bit controversial, but governor who was formerly head of Secretary of Energy, Rick Perry, wanted to mandate the HPV vaccine. I worked for a physician group which opposes all mandates. They don't think it's appropriate for any government at any level to tell parents what they should do with their children. So I was brought in with my friend Catherine to help organize a transpartisan coalition against this. Now, that particular view of doctors who don't think the state should force parents to force their kids into take a certain drug was not held by everyone. Okay, some of my progressive friends or people who ran coalitions or who ran groups were concerned about the fact that Secretary Perry's or Governor Perry's chief of staff left the governor's office and worked for the pharmaceutical company, which is going to benefit from mandating this vaccine. So there's kind of this crony capitalist thing. There were some scientific groups that were concerned, scientific medical groups that were concerned about the science behind it, that it was not proven to be effective as being claimed. And there's still some concerns. There were some pro-family conservative groups who didn't like the message being given to 13-year-old girls that we're going to prepare you to have sex, so we're going to give you a shot so you can be safer in having sex. So, the anti-crony capitalists didn't need to be convinced of the medical people's position. The medical people's position didn't have to be convinced of the pro-family. Pro-family people didn't have to be convinced of the lack of science supporting the full mandate of this thing. But you can still organize in opposition to this particular mandate by bringing all these people together. They didn't agree why we're all together. Well, let me restate that. They agreed that they all opposed the mandate. They all oppose the mandate for different reasons. And that's one way of thinking about organizing. Not everyone has to agree on why we're there except for the end. So that's one way of organizing. Another way of thinking about it is around principles. And that's also an important way of thinking about how to organize transpartisanly. So I helped create in the mid-2000s with a friend Brad and James the Liberty Coalition, which was a coalition of about 90 groups across the political spectrum on civil liberties. So we opposed the Patriot Act, we opposed Real ID, we opposed Secure Flight, E-Verify, other kind of intrusions into our Fourth Amendment rights and protections. And the principle which organized everyone was the Fourth Amendment. that, we should all be secure in our stuff, in our property, and from snooping from the federal government or any kind of government. So that, in that case, that was organizing around a set of principles. The Fourth Amendment. We've also did First Amendment stuff. So the First Amendment, whatever the principle is, you can organize around the principle. The first example around Texas with Governor Perry, we organized around the ends. We don't want a mandate from that state government. Why? Everyone had different reasons. So there's different ways of thinking about how you can organize at any level. One thing that I hear from a lot of people who do want to kind of participate in these kind of coalitions or community building efforts is like, how do you start? How do you engage in these kind of conversations in such a way that they're useful to the ends that you're seeking, solving a particular problem, whatever it happens to be. And the analogy I like to use is when you date. If you go on your first date, most likely, if you want to have a second date, you're not going to start yelling at your date how stupid and wrong they are for whatever belief system they have. You're going to be curious about them. You're going to want to understand why they believe what they believe or why they did what they did. Now, if you start yelling at them and calling them names, it's probably going to be your last date. That's kind of the approach I encourage people to take, is that kind of curiosity. Now, it's not saying like you have to completely disregard everything you believe. That's not true at all. It's just kind of creating that space in your own mind for that curiosity to emerge. Like, why do you believe what you believe? Why do you hold that perspective? Why do what in your past might have led you to have that set of experiences that created that worldview for yourself? And what are the ends that you seek in certain policy prescriptions that you might have? Because I find that 99% of people have good hearts. They might be, in my perspective, wrong in their means to get to the ends that they seek. But they do it not because they hate human beings, because they actually care about other people. They actually want to solve real problems. They want to see people happy in their lives and healthy and successful. Maybe there's some sociopaths who are not like that, but most people do care. And if you approach people as if they're good, caring, compassionate human beings, and you're curious about them, that's the first step, I would think, about in terms of like engaging those kind of dialogues that are necessary to move the conversation forward. And then I would say that not only do you need to do that with someone else or other peoples, you also need to do that with yourself. The first step might be to recognize the limited but partial truths that you have yourself, because we're not God or gods or goddesses. We don't know everything. And if you recognize that to be true, and you create a little bit of space in your own psyche, like, well, wait, maybe I don't know everything. Maybe my worldview is limited. Maybe I don't, maybe I need to study more, explore more options. And what I would recommend people do, and this is what I do, is, okay, great, I recognize that, and then I go explore across the ideological spectrum how people think about certain issues that are important to me. So, I read the American Conservative magazine. I also write for the Conservative magazine. I read Reason magazine, a libertarian rag. I read Z magazine, which is, puts Chomsky's work out. I read The Nation. I read Mother Jones. Anything and everything that I can find across the ideological spectrum that's thoughtful. I'm not really interested in like hardcore partisan stuff. I'm interested in really thoughtful pieces from people from all across the political spectrum. And I don't read it to have the arguments in my head how stupid these people are. I read it because I'm curious about why they think the way they think and what can I learn from them. Whether it's someone from the green perspective or a hardcore democratic socialist or a hardcore conservative, libertarian, whatever perspective they come from, as long as they're thoughtful in their approach. That, for me, kind of deconditions my mind from believing that I know everything, that I'm right in my belief systems, that people should do exactly what I think they should do. No, that's nonsense. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that I'm fluid, I have no belief systems, I don't have any grounding in my beliefs. I do, but I'm open, and I learn from those different perspectives. I learned two things. I learned how to debate better my own perspective, which is important. Debate, a real debate, not ideological attacks, but a real debate. And then I also learned that I'm limited in my worldview, and there's pieces of these different worldviews like, wow, I never thought about it that way. How can I integrate that new truth into my worldview? That's where my green sensibilities came from, because I started reading like ecofeminism and some of the more ecologically oriented thinkers and writers, like, wow, I really need to think more, less agenically. Not that I gave up my agenic libertarian belief systems about the primacy of the individual and we should all be free, but I'm like, wow, I need to study like in ecological perspective and integrate that into my worldview. And the same thing with like feminism or, different kind of ideologies that are out there. I'm like, wow, I don't think that's the answer. Like no one group of people have the answer. It's not like, feminists might say it's all about the patriarchy, or it's all about white power from some of the colored folks, or it's all about the state from the libertarians, or whatever. No, what I try to attempt to do, and I'm encouraging other people to do, is say there might be some truths there. There might be something called the patriarchy, which is problematic for females. There might be something called white privilege. Okay, I'm not going to immediately say, oh my God, that's stupid. No, I'm going to say, that's interesting. What can I learn from those people who write about that stuff? I'm already a libertarian, so I already believe in the limitations of the, limiting the state, or a libertarian leaning, so I already believe in that. But, so I would suggest, as I do, that okay, that's curious. I'm curious now. Why do you believe that? Why do you believe it's this, this, this? Now, it's not one size fits all. I don't believe like it's all about the patriarchy, it's all about white privilege, it's all about the state, it's all about whatever. It's like those are limited but partial truths. How can I integrate them into a larger map or model? The Transpartisan model about power dynamics and cultural issues. And that's what I would encourage folks to do, is kind of try to decondition their mind a little bit, be open to other possibilities, explore those other possibilities, pull from them the limited but partial truths that you might find for yourself, engage in conversations, and then kind of take that new openness and that bigger map and model into your community and engage with that from that curious space, other people. So, I've talked about kind of the three realms or spheres that I think about and work in: the individual, the institutional, and the systemic. And they interrelate. And one issue that definitely interrelates is food. When I work with my individual clients, I do a lot of work around nutrition and diet because it's so important for human health and well-being. But I'm also thinking outside of just the individual and the effects on the environment. How we do our food production, whether it's animal husbandry or fruits, vegetables, and seeds and nuts, et cetera, farming. That's kind of institutional and systemic, and I kind of look across that. And that's one area that I also find that brings a lot of people together. And I remember I used to, I do some education policy years ago, and I used to work for a very conservative organization. And we agreed to disagree on tons of stuff, but I did education policy. And I'd go to their conferences, and I happened to be Jewish, and it was 99% evangelical Christian, 1% hardcore conservative Catholic. And it was nice. They'd pray for my soul because I didn't have the Jesus thing going on, which is fine. And but what was fascinating is I was there to talk education, but they knew my interest in food, and we talked about food policy, like during lunches and dinners, organic food. There was a strong interest among this really conservative crowd about organic food. And I was like, this is really fascinating. So it's not just like the hippies, dippies who love organic food. It's like the conservatives, and there's a lot of libertarians. So, food, everyone has to eat. Most people want a clean environment. Most people have care and compassion for animals. Most people want soil that's not depleted. They want soil to last for a long time, so their kids and their grandkids could have healthy and healthy food. So I find like food is one thing that transcends political boundaries. And the local food movement, whether it's the slow food movement or the organic food movement, or I'm actually interested in the post-organic food movement, like people like Joel Salatin, who are not just doing monoculture crop production that's organic, but looking at systemic approach to how you produce food. So you're not producing, negative consequences to the environment. Everything that's produced on the farm is an input to another process. There's no waste, quote unquote waste. That's amazing to me. And I find more and more people across the spectrum, and I happen to be a consultant for the Paleo FX, which is a paleo group. And there's strong interest in like post-organic agriculture with that crowd. And even the vegetarian movement, there's a strong interest. So it's not just even it's post-ideological, it's like there's a transpartisanship within food, different groups of people. But everyone seems to, at some level, be concerned about food. And that's one way of starting to organize people locally, like the farmers markets and food co-ops, get to know your neighbors, get to know your farmer. Once you start solving those kind of problems, then you can get together and solve other problems, because once again, it's around food. You can break bread, or if you're paleo, you can break something else, eat together. And it's a great way of community building around food, because we all have to eat. Most people, unless you're sociopathic, care about the environment, care about the future for your kids, your grandkids, as I said, want humane treatment of animals, want sustainable development in terms of agriculture. So it's a great way of at least starting a conversation around community building. And it's also a really interesting way of changing the market, because the more people who engage in this, and this is of interest to me more as a libertarian too, it's like, okay, I don't want the government coming in and telling people what they need to eat, because they usually choose incorrectly, especially around fat and carbs, that whole kind of debate. But you can change the marketplace by your choices in the market. So the more people who eat organically or sustainably, the more people who come together for farmers markets, these large, big agricultural companies take notice, and it changes the market. So, you can change things with getting together and having dialogues with your community. You can change things also by what you buy and how you buy things too.